Co-ops. Definitely not my favorite subject in the world because a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with co-ops, or I would say more of like a frustrated relationship with co-ops because there's definitely a lot of steps that take place when people purchase a co-op in New York City. Now, co-ops exist in other places around the world. They're not just in New York City. However, I do have to say that they're probably more common in New York City than probably anywhere else in the world. And if somebody else knows if that's not the answer, please share in the comments because I would really love to know because that's definitely an assumption, but I have a funny feeling that's correct. So just to give you guys a little bit of an overview of what a co-op board is. When you're purchasing a co-op, you don't actually own the actual unit that you're purchasing. You own shares of the entire building. So basically, you guys are all investors in the building. The difference with a condo, which the two are often compared to, is a condo building, you do own the actual unit that you live in and not shares of the building. So that's the difference between the two. So you're probably thinking at this point, okay, Lauren, that's great, but what do I really care, honestly, as long as I'm allowed to live there? So the reason why people do care about having a co-op versus condo is because typically, since with a co-op, you're a shareholder of the building, the people who are also shareholders are typically a lot more involved in the community as a whole, so the whole building's community, and also your ownership and also your tenancy of your actual unit that you're living in. So that's why it typically is a little bit harder to get past a co-op board. It typically is a little bit harder to do actual work, so actual renovations and things to your actual unit that you're living in because the co-op board is just way more typically involved than a condo association. Now, I have also seen condo associations that are very involved as well. You tend to see this more with a co-op, just to let you know. So a co-op board is made up of people who live in the building. So they are also elected by people who live in the building. So you can choose to run for the board or not run for the board. The board is going to be making decisions on financing, maintenance, rules, and regulations, really what is allowed and what isn't allowed in the building. And that's why sometimes people, if they do want to kind of like take charge of what is going on in their building, they do like get involved with the board because they feel like they have some say in that. So some people don't like co-ops specifically because they think that the board has way too much control over what is happening in the building. Now, when it comes to the purchasing process, you will have to have an interview with a board if you're buying a co-op. The variations of what the interview entails is different from board to board. And so it's not like a set standard, I would say, when it comes to like all board interviews and all co-ops. But basically, they're going to be interviewing you to figure out you are a good resident of the building. So here's a couple things that they're going to be looking for. One, can you afford it? Are you going to be respectful of other people that live in the building? Are you going to be loud, obnoxious, and basically like kind of try to take over things in the building? Like they're kind of looking for things like that, I would say. So that's for the most part. Now, I want to make this very clear too, because this is a question I get a lot of times. So fair housing still applies to co-op boards. It applies to all housing in the United States. So this is not ever a matter of anything that is covered under fair housing. So I want to make that very clear because if you ever feel like that with a co-op board, then you have your rights with fair housing. Honestly, sometimes I do hear complaints around that. So when going on an interview with a co-op board, what are some of the suggestions I would make? The first thing that I would say is, of course, just be yourself because typically that is going to be your best bet rather than trying to be somebody else or like fake it to get through with a board interview. And then secondly, if you plan on doing renovations to your unit, I wouldn't over talk about that in the board because you have to think about in buildings, a lot of people don't like a lot of construction going on in buildings, right? Like think about if you live in any type of a building or have ever lived in an apartment building at this time and there's construction going on in that building or around, even on the outside, how annoying is that, right? So if you over talk about renovating your unit, that could be a turnoff for some boards because they might be thinking, oh God, now I'm gonna have to deal with all this construction on this floor and they just don't wanna deal with that. So it kind of might scare them a little bit. So I would kind of downplay that even if they ask you that. You know, people do expect people to renovate units, like it happens all the time, but some people come in and they're like, I plan on doing this, and they have like all these plans to show them and it's just very, very overwhelming for the board. So I definitely don't think that's the best case scenario, but I do think being yourself, if they do ask you questions, be like, maybe you're interested from over time to make some changes here and there, like just kind of downplay it, things like that. There was this one article I was reading one time and it was talking about what not to do and what to do in a co-op board. And I thought this was really funny because I'm gonna share this to you. There's a lot of like, say like musicians in New York City and like performing arts and stuff like that. So if you have any type of like music background or anything like that, they were saying like, if like a person who plays like an instrument, like the trumpet, like don't in that interview, like tell them that you're gonna be like practicing your trumpet all day or practicing your opera singing all day or something in your apartment because like some people will literally go into those meetings and share that with them. And then people in the building are literally thinking, oh my gosh, this person's gonna be singing opera all day in their apartment. And we're gonna hear it throughout like the entire floor or the trumpet or like whatever it may be, right? You just literally don't wanna come across as being like a pain or obnoxious in the building because that's literally what they're looking for. Like that's all it comes down to is that they wanna make sure you can afford it and they wanna make sure you're not gonna be like a troublemaker in the building basically and like causing a scene and not being polite and following the rules and things like that. I think that some people get like really, really intimidated by co-op like interviews and they definitely aren't like that. They just wanna make sure that, you know, like you can kind of like cooperate with everybody else in the building. That's it. I would say that it's not typically a whole thing. So that's basically what comes down to a co-op board. So sometimes pets are allowed with a co-op, sometimes they're not. And then if they are, it's typically a weight limit. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like some medium, small dogs and cats typically are allowed, but sometimes with bigger dogs, people do have issues. It really depends on board. So just pay attention to that. But overall, that's going to be the process for a co-op. Another thing is in New York City specifically, co-ops tend to be at least 20% down. So that's something to keep in mind. There are some exceptions to the rule, always exceptions to the rule, but typically 20% down. So if you are interested in a co-op, just kind of keep that in mind and figure out your budget along those lines, like knowing that you're probably gonna have to put 20% down, or you're gonna have to find the few co-ops that don't require that. So if you guys have any specific questions about co-ops in New York City, please share them in the comments, or if you wanna share your experiences with board interviews or anything like that in your actual like co-op board associations, because as always, I love hearing from you guys in the comments.